Who taught you that piece? The maestro's voice trembled, barely louder than a breath, yet it cut through the grand concert hall like a crack in glass. And just moments earlier, the same room had been filled with quiet laughter, the kind polished people use when they think they're being kind. When a little girl in a faded blue dress, Emily Carter, walked toward a Steinway that cost more than her mother would earn in 10 years. The chandeliers above shimmered like frozen stars, reflecting off marble floors so clean they mirrored every step she took. And the air carried that unmistakable scent of lemon polish and expensive perfume, a world built to impress, not to welcome, especially not someone like her, someone who wasn't on the guest list, someone who had been told twice already to stay close to the wall and don't touch anything. Her mother, Laura, moved quietly along the side aisle with a tray balanced in steady hands, a ghost in a room of giants, her eyes flickering with worry. As Emily slipped away, unnoticed by most but not all, a man in a tailored tuxedo leaned toward his companion and smirked, whispering just loud enough, "This should be entertaining." And another voice followed, softer but sharper. "Does she even know how to play?" The laughter didn't echo. It lingered, thin and cutting, like paper against skin. But Emily didn't look at them. She didn't look at anyone. Her gaze was fixed on the piano, not the spotlight, not the audience, just the instrument, as if everything else in the room had faded away, as if the world had narrowed to 88 keys and the quiet space between each note. She paused at the bench, her small hands hovering just above the polished wood, fingers slightly trembling, not from fear, but from something deeper, something older than her 10 years, because this wasn't the first time she had seen a piano, just the first time anyone had allowed her close enough to touch one like this. Somewhere in the crowd, Jonathan Reeves, the maestro whose name alone could sell out halls from New York to Vienna, sat watching with a neutral expression, a man known for his precision, for his control, for never letting emotion show on stage or off. His presence alone was enough to make seasoned performers nervous. Yet now his attention drifted toward this unexpected moment, drawn not by the girl, but by the stillness that seemed to gather around her, a stillness that didn't belong in a room like this. Emily sat down slowly, the bench slightly too high for her, her worn shoes dangling just above the floor, and for a second, nothing happened. No music, no movement, just silence, the kind that stretches just long enough for doubt to creep in, for the audience to exchange glances, for someone to clear their throat, and then, almost imperceptibly, her fingers lowered onto the keys, not pressing, just resting, as if she was listening, as if the piano was speaking first, and in that fragile, suspended moment, something shifted, something no one could explain yet, not even the man who would soon be standing. Unable to hold back the tears building in his eyes, the first note did not announce itself. It breathed into the room so softly that people were not sure if they had heard it or imagined it. A single tone suspended in the air like a thread of light, and then another followed, and another, each one placed with a precision that did not belong to hesitation but to memory, deep, lived memory, the kind that cannot be taught. The murmurs in the audience began to fade, not because anyone told them to be quiet, but because something inside them chose silence instead. Emily's fingers moved slowly at first, not rushing, not proving anything, just unfolding the melody as if she had been carrying it for years. The polished black surface of the piano reflected her small hands, fragile against the vast instrument. Yet every key she touched responded as if it had been waiting for her. Across the hall, Laura Carter stopped mid-step, the tray in her hands suddenly heavier, her breath caught somewhere between fear and disbelief, because she had never heard her daughter play like this, not at home on the broken upright, with two missing keys, not in the quiet nights when Emily thought no one was listening. This was something else, something fuller, something impossible. A man in the front row shifted in his seat, his earlier smirk gone, replaced by a tightening jaw as he leaned forward, trying to understand what he was hearing, and beside him, a woman slowly lowered her program, her eyes no longer scanning printed names but fixed entirely on the girl under the light. Jonathan Reeves had not moved at first, his posture still, his expression unreadable, but his eyes had changed, narrowing slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition. Because the sequence of notes, the subtle pauses, the phrasing between silence and sound, It was not just correct. It was intimate. It was personal. And that was what unsettled him. Emily continued. Her shoulders relaxed now, the tremble gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. She was not performing for the room. She was not performing at all. She was remembering. Each chord carried a weight that the audience could feel but not explain, and the hall itself seemed to respond, the acoustics catching every nuance, every soft crescendo, every delicate restraint, amplifying not volume, but emotion. The chandelier lights shimmered above, but no one looked up anymore. No one looked anywhere else. Time itself seemed to slow, stretching the space between notes into something almost sacred. A man near the aisle let out a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding. Another leaned back as if steadying himself, as if the music had reached somewhere too deep, too quickly, and still, no one spoke. Because speaking would break it, and no one wanted to be the one who shattered whatever this was becoming. And then, just as the melody turned, just as it reached a passage so specific, so unmistakable, Jonathan Reeves's hand tightened around the armrest, his knuckles widening, his composure slipping not outwardly, but internally, a crack forming in a place he had kept sealed for years, because this part, this exact phrasing, had never been performed, never published, never heard beyond a single quiet room long ago. And yet here it was, alive again, in the hands of a child who should not have known it, who should not have been able to touch it. And in that moment, the question began to rise inside him, not as curiosity, but as something closer to disbelief, something that would soon demand an answer. He was not prepared to hear. The music did not rush toward an ending. It deepened, pulling the room further into a place none of them had expected to go, and Emily's fingers, small and steady, began to move with a quiet confidence that no longer belonged to chance. Each note now carried intention. Each pause felt chosen, as if she was not just playing a composition, but revealing something hidden inside it. Jonathan Reeves slowly rose from his seat, not with the dramatic urgency of a performer, but with the careful, almost fragile movement of a man stepping into a memory he had tried to leave behind. The audience noticed. Of course they noticed, because a man like him did not stand in the middle of a performance, especially not for a child. But no one dared to interrupt. No one dared to even whisper, because something sacred had taken hold of the room. His eyes never left Emily's hands, watching the way she shaped the melody, the way she leaned into certain notes and held back on others, not as a student would, but as someone who understood why those notes existed in the first place. And then it came, the passage that confirmed everything, a subtle variation, a shift so delicate that only the original composer could recognize it, a deviation that had never been written down, never recorded, never shared. Jonathan's breath caught, his composure breaking in a way no one there had ever witnessed, because that variation had been born in a quiet evening years ago, written not for an audience, but for a single person sitting beside him, someone who had listened with a smile that never needed applause, someone whose absence had left a silence he had never filled again. And yet now, in this vast hall, under these brilliant lights, that silence was being answered, not by him, but by a girl who should not have known any of it. Emily's eyes remained on the keys, unaware of the storm she had awakened, unaware that every note was unraveling a story that did not belong to her, and yet somehow lived within her. Laura stood frozen at the edge of the aisle, tears forming without permission, her heart torn between pride and fear, because she knew this moment was changing something they could not return from. The audience leaned forward as one, drawn in completely, no longer observers but witnesses. And when Emily reached the final sequence, she did not rush it. She allowed it to breathe, stretching the last few notes into a quiet, aching release, the sound lingering in the air long after her fingers had lifted from the keys. And for a second, there was nothing, no applause, no movement, just silence so complete it felt like the entire hall had forgotten how to exist. And then Jonathan Reeves took a single step forward, his voice barely steady as he spoke the words that would change everything. Where did you learn that piece? And though the question was simple, the weight behind it carried years of memory, loss, and a truth that was about to surface in a way no one in that room was prepared for. Emily did not answer right away, her small hands still resting above the keys as if the music had not fully left them. And For a moment, she looked like a child again, not the quiet force that had just held an entire hall in silence. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet Jonathan Reeves, and there was no fear in them, only a calm honesty that felt almost out of place in a room built on performance and expectation. "I heard it before," she said softly, her voice barely carrying beyond the first few rows. But in the stillness, it reached everyone. Jonathan took another step closer, his gaze searching her face, as if the answer might be written there, as if he could trace the path of that impossible memory back to its source. "That piece was never released," he said, not accusing, not doubting, just stating a truth that had defined his silence for years. A ripple moved through the audience, confusion replacing certainty, because now this was no longer just about talent. It was about something deeper, something that did not fit the neat boundaries of logic. Emily glanced briefly toward her mother, and Laura felt her breath catch again, a silent exchange passing between them, permission, reassurance, something unspoken but understood. And then Emily looked back at the maestro. "There was a tape," she continued, her words simple, unpolished, an old one. It was scratched and quiet in some places, but the song was still there. Jonathan's expression shifted, the composure of a lifetime beginning to give way to something raw, something human, because he knew that tape. He knew it in a way that went beyond memory. It had been recorded late one evening in a small living room far from any stage, the microphone cheap, the room imperfect. The music never meant to leave those walls. "Where did you find it?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost afraid of the answer. Emily hesitated, not because she did not know, but because she did not realize the weight it carried. "My mom cleans a house on Maple Ridge," she said. "There is a box in the attic with old things. No one touches it. I was waiting one day, and I found the tape player. It still worked." A quiet gasp moved through the front rows, the kind that comes when a hidden thread begins to reveal itself. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief second, and when he opened them again, they were no longer the eyes of a performer analyzing technique. They were the eyes of a man standing face to face with something he thought he had lost forever, because that house, that address, it was not just any place. It was a home he had not returned to in years, a place filled with echoes he had chosen not to hear. The audience watched in silence as realization unfolded across his face, each piece falling into place with a quiet inevitability. Emily shifted slightly on the bench, unaware of the storm her words had created. To her it had been simple. She had heard something beautiful, and she had remembered it the only way she knew how. Jonathan took another step forward, closer now to the piano, to the girl, to the truth that had somehow traveled from a forgotten attic to the center of a grand hall. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that no performance ever had. "That tape," he said slowly, "was never meant for the world, and yet here it was, not just heard, but understood." And in that moment, the room realized something profound, that what they had witnessed was not just talent, not just skill, but a connection that defied distance, status, and expectation, something that could not be bought, taught, or staged, only found, often in the quietest places, by those no one was watching. The room did not move, not even when the last word left his lips, because something larger than curiosity had taken hold, something that made people forget their roles, their titles, their carefully constructed identities. And Jonathan Reeves stood there, just a few feet from the piano, no longer the untouchable figure they had come to admire, but a man confronting a past he had sealed away. His gaze softened as he looked at Emily, not as an outsider, not as a child who did not belong, but as someone who had carried a piece of his life without even knowing it. "Do you still have it?" he asked quietly. And the question was not about the tape itself. It was about everything tied to it. Emily nodded, her small voice steady. "I listened to it a lot. I tried to remember all of it. Some parts were hard to hear, so I filled them in the best I could." A faint murmur moved through the audience again, not disbelief this time, but something closer to awe, because what she described was not imitation. It was interpretation. It was creation born from fragments. And Jonathan exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to release years of silence. "You did not just remember it," he said, his voice carrying now, not loud, but undeniable. "You understood it." The words settled over the room with a weight no applause could match. Laura's hands trembled slightly at her side, her eyes fixed on her daughter as if seeing her for the first time, not just as the quiet girl who stayed out of the way, but as someone who had been building something extraordinary in the shadows, someone who had taken moments between waiting, between being invisible, and turned them into something lasting, something undeniable. Emily shifted on the bench, unsure how to respond, because to her, it had never been about proving anything. It had simply been about the music, about the way it made her feel, the way it filled the quiet spaces of her world. Jonathan stepped closer until he stood beside the piano, close enough to see the faint wear on the edges of the keys, where countless hands had played before, and now hers among them. "Will you play it again?" he asked, and this time, there was no challenge in his voice, no test, only a request, a quiet hope. Emily looked at him for a moment, then back at the piano, and without hesitation, her fingers returned to their place. The room held its breath once more, but this time, it was different. There was no doubt, no judgment, only anticipation. And as the first note sounded again, it carried not just the memory of what had been played before, but the promise of something new, something shared, and Jonathan did not return to his seat. He remained standing beside her, listening, not as a master evaluating a student, but as someone witnessing his own story being told in a way he had never imagined possible. And around them, the audience leaned in, not because they were being entertained, but because they were being changed, quietly, completely, in a way that would follow them long after the lights dimmed and the hall returned to silence the second time she played. The music no longer belonged to memory alone. It evolved, expanding in ways that felt both familiar and entirely new. And Emily's fingers moved with a quiet authority that no one in that room had expected from a child. Each note now carried not only what had been written, but what had been lived, what had been lost, and what had somehow been found again. Jonathan Reeves stood beside her, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders softened as if the weight he had carried for years was slowly being lifted, not all at once, but note by note, breath by breath. And as the melody unfolded, something shifted in the audience. The people who had once leaned back in their seats now leaned forward, their expressions stripped of judgment, replaced by something deeper, something more honest, because this was no longer a performance to evaluate. It was a moment to witness. Laura Carter lowered the tray she had been holding and set it gently on a nearby table, her hands free now, her heart no longer racing with fear, but swelling with something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Pride, quiet but undeniable. She watched her daughter not as someone out of place, but as someone who had always belonged somewhere like this, even if no one had noticed until now. Emily reached a passage where the original melody had once faltered on that old tape, the sound broken, the notes unclear, but here, in this hall, she did not hesitate. She filled the silence with something new, something that did not imitate but completed, and Jonathan felt it instantly. That subtle shift, that gentle addition, it was not his, and yet it fit perfectly, as if the music itself had been waiting for someone else to finish what he had left undone. His eyes closed for a moment, not to escape, but to feel it fully, and when he opened them again, they were no longer searching for answers. They were accepting them. The final notes approached slowly, not rushed, not forced, allowed to linger just long enough to leave an imprint. And when the last sound faded into the vast stillness of the hall, no one moved, not because they did not know what to do, but because they knew that anything they did might break the fragile perfection of what had just happened. Jonathan turned slightly toward Emily, his voice steady now, but filled with something that could not be rehearsed. "Music like that does not come from practice alone," he said quietly, and the words carried farther than any applause ever could. Emily looked up at him, unsure of what to say, but she did not need to speak, because in that moment, the silence between them held more meaning than any explanation. And then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the room began to breathe again. A single pair of hands came together, then another, and then the sound grew, not loud, not explosive, but steady, respectful, a recognition not just of talent, but of truth. And Jonathan did not join the applause right away. He remained still for a moment longer, looking at the girl who had unknowingly carried his past into the present, And finally, he nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried more weight than any standing ovation, because it was not given lightly, and it was not given often, and in that simple motion, the balance of the room shifted forever, the line between who belonged and who did not quietly erased, leaving behind something far more important, something that could not be measured by wealth, status, or expectation, only by the quiet, undeniable presence of something real. The applause did not fade quickly. It lingered, softer now, but more deliberate, as if each person in that room understood they were not just clapping for a performance. They were acknowledging something they had nearly missed. And Jonathan Reeves finally lifted his hands and joined them, not as a figure of authority setting the tone, but as a man offering respect, his eyes still fixed on Emily with a quiet intensity that had not left since the first note. And when the sound slowly settled back into silence, he turned slightly toward the audience, then back to the piano, as if choosing his next words with care. "There are moments," he began, his voice steady, carrying easily through the hall without effort, "when music reminds us that it does not belong to stages, or titles, or even those who create it." A subtle shift moved through the crowd, people leaning in once more, not out of curiosity now, but out of something closer to reverence. "Sometimes," he continued, "it finds its way into places we forget to look, into hands we never expect." Emily sat quietly beside him, her posture still, her eyes lowered again, not from uncertainty, but from a natural humility that seemed untouched by the attention surrounding her. Laura stood at the edge of the aisle, her hands now clasped together, her expression no longer guarded but open, as if something inside her had finally been allowed to breathe. Jonathan looked back at Emily, the faintest hint of a smile forming, not wide, not performative, but real. "Would you stand with me?" he asked gently. And for a moment, Emily hesitated, not because she was afraid, but because she had never imagined being asked something like that. Not here, not in front of people who had only just moments ago seen her as invisible. But she slid carefully off the bench and stood beside him, small next to his presence, yet somehow no longer overshadowed by it. The contrast between them remained, but it no longer defined the moment. Jonathan turned to face the audience fully now, his hand gesturing lightly toward her, not presenting her as a novelty, but as an equal in something far more meaningful. "This is Emily Carter," he said, and the name carried across the room with a clarity that felt like recognition, like something being placed where it always should have been. "Tonight, she did not just play music," he continued. "She gave it back a voice I thought was gone." A quiet murmur of understanding passed through the rows, people exchanging glances not of confusion but of realization, because they had all felt it, even if they could not explain it. Jonathan paused, letting the words settle, then added softly, "And she reminded me that talent does not ask for permission to exist." Emily looked up at him then, her expression still calm, but her eyes reflecting something new, not pride, not disbelief, but a quiet awareness that something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the way she would be seen from this moment forward. And as the audience rose to their feet, not in a sudden rush but in a steady, unified motion, the sound of their applause returned, fuller this time, warmer, not for a spectacle, but for something genuine, something rare. And in that moment, the space between who belonged and who did not quietly disappeared, replaced by something far more enduring, something that would not fade when the lights dimmed and the doors closed, because it had already taken root in every person who had witnessed it. The applause continued to rise, but this time it carried something different, not just admiration, but a quiet sense of accountability, as if every person in that room was remembering the moment they had underestimated her, and realizing they had almost missed something extraordinary. Jonathan Reeves did not step away from Emily. He remained beside her, not as a protector, but as someone who understood that moments like this were fragile, easily misunderstood if left without direction. And as the sound slowly softened again, he turned slightly toward the front rows where the earlier laughter had come from, his expression calm, not accusing, but unmistakably aware. "We are often quick to judge what we do not recognize," he said, his voice steady and measured, and the words landed gently, but firmly, like a truth no one could ignore. A man in a tailored suit shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet discomfort, while others lowered their gaze, not out of shame alone, but out of reflection. Jonathan did not linger on them. He simply allowed the moment to exist, then turned back to Emily, his tone softening again. "Tell me," he asked, "when you first heard that music, what did you feel?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight that invited something deeper than a rehearsed answer. Emily looked down for a moment, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the piano bench, as if grounding herself. It felt like someone was trying to say something. She replied slowly, choosing her words with care, but they did not know how to finish it. A quiet stillness followed her answer, because it was not what anyone expected from a child. It was not technical, it was not trained, it was something else entirely, something instinctive. Jonathan's expression shifted again, this time with a hint of wonder, because that was exactly what it had been. Not a finished piece, not a perfected composition, but a fragment of something left incomplete, and somehow, she had understood that without ever being told. "And tonight," he asked gently, "did you finish it?" Emily hesitated for just a second, then nodded, not with pride, but with quiet certainty. "I think so," she said, and the simplicity of her answer carried more truth than any elaborate explanation ever could. Laura felt tears slip freely now, no longer trying to hold them back, because in that moment, she saw not just what her daughter had done, but who she had become without anyone noticing. Someone who listened, someone who felt, someone who completed what others had left behind. Jonathan took a slow breath, then looked out at the audience once more. "Then we were not just listening to music," he said softly. "We were witnessing something being made whole," and the words settled into the room like a quiet resolution, the kind that does not demand attention but changes everything nonetheless. And as the lights above continued to glow and the grand hall held its breath one more time, it became clear that this was no longer just an evening of performance. It was a turning point, not only for Emily, but for everyone who had been there to see what happens when something overlooked is finally allowed to be heard. The words lingered in the air long after they were spoken, and for a moment, no one seemed willing to break the silence that followed, not because they did not have anything to say, but because they understood that what had just happened could not be easily explained. Jonathan Reeves stood still beside Emily, his gaze no longer searching, no longer questioning, but settled, as if something inside him had finally found its place, and slowly, he turned toward her again, his voice softer now, carrying a quiet decision rather than a question. "Would you like to learn?" he asked, and the simplicity of it made the room lean in once more, because this was not an offer made lightly, not from someone like him, not in a moment like this. Emily blinked slightly, the weight of the question taking a second to reach her, because until now, everything she had done had been alone, in quiet spaces, without guidance, without expectation, just her and the sound she carried inside her. "Learn what?" she asked gently, not out of doubt, but because she had never been invited into that world before. Jonathan allowed a small breath of a smile, something rare and unguarded. "Everything you have not been shown yet," he replied, and the meaning behind it spread through the audience like a ripple. People exchanging looks not of surprise, but of recognition, because they understood what was being offered, not just lessons, not just opportunity, but a door, one that had always been closed to someone like her. Laura covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with disbelief, because she knew what this meant, not in theory, but in reality, in the way it could change the direction of a life that had always been built around survival. Emily looked at her mother, just for a moment, and in that glance was a lifetime of quiet understanding, of nights spent waiting, of small sacrifices that had never been spoken out loud. And then she looked back at Jonathan, her expression steady once more. "Yes," she said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that carried far beyond her voice. And something shifted again in the room, something final, as if a line had been crossed that could not be undone. Jonathan nodded slowly, not as a performer acknowledging applause, but as a man accepting a promise. "Then this is where it begins," he said, and the words did not feel like an ending. They felt like the opening of something larger, something that extended far beyond the walls of that hall. The audience rose again, not because they were asked to, but because they felt compelled to. the sound of their applause fuller now, warmer, not just for what they had witnessed, but for what was about to come, and in the center of it all, under the soft glow of the lights, a girl who had once been told to stay invisible stood beside a man who had spent his life being seen, and for the first time, the space between them did not exist at all. The applause did not feel like an ending. It felt like a threshold, something the room had stepped through together without realizing it. And as the sound slowly settled into a softer rhythm, Jonathan Reeves turned slightly, gesturing toward the piano once more, not as a stage, but as a place of beginning. "One more time," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach her, and this time it was not a request for proof, not a moment to impress, but something else entirely. Emily looked at the keys, then back at him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something new in her expression, not uncertainty, but awareness that what she played next would not just be heard, it would be remembered. She sat again, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if she understood the weight of what had been placed in her hands. The hall grew still, not because it had to, but because no one wanted to miss what came next, and when her fingers touched the keys again, the sound that followed was different, not just in tone, but in purpose. It carried the same melody, but now it moved forward, beyond what had been written, beyond what had been remembered, into something that belonged entirely to her. Jonathan remained standing beside her, but he no longer watched every note. Instead, his gaze lifted slightly, as if he was listening to something larger than the music itself, something unfolding in real time, something that could not be planned or repeated. The audience felt it too. That subtle shift from witnessing a rare moment to becoming part of it, a shared awareness that this was no longer about a girl at a piano or a maestro in a hall. It was about the creation of something that did not exist before this night. Laura stood with her hands pressed gently together, her breath steady now, her eyes filled not with fear or disbelief, but with a quiet strength, because she could see it clearly. This was not a single moment. It was the start of a path, one that would not be easy, but one that was finally visible. Emily moved through the final notes with a calm precision, allowing each sound to settle fully before moving to the next, not rushing, not holding back, simply letting it be. And when the last note faded, it did not disappear, it stayed, lingering in the space it had created, and in that stillness, Jonathan finally spoke again, his voice steady, but carrying a depth that reached every corner of the hall. "That," he said quietly, "is where music becomes truth." And this time, there was no immediate applause, no sudden reaction, just a deep, shared silence, as if everyone present understood that what they had just witnessed was not meant to be interrupted, not meant to be reduced to noise. And when the applause did return, it was slower, more intentional, each clap carrying meaning, not just recognition of talent, but acknowledgement of something far more rare, something that could not be taught or given, only discovered, often in the places no one thinks to look. And as the lights continued to glow and the hall held that fragile balance between sound and silence, it became clear that this night would not be remembered for who performed, but for what was revealed. Time did not rush forward after that moment. It seemed to expand, stretching beyond the walls of the hall, beyond the night itself, and in the quiet that followed, something irreversible had taken root. Jonathan Reeves stepped back slightly, not away from Emily, but to give her space, a subtle gesture that carried respect rather than distance. The audience slowly returned to their seats, but the energy in the room had changed completely. Conversations did not resume, no one reached for their phones, no one looked away, because they all understood they were still inside something that had not fully ended. Emily remained near the piano, her hands resting gently at her sides now, no longer needing to hold onto the keys, as if the music had already settled into her. Laura approached carefully, her steps quiet but certain, and when she reached her daughter, she did not speak right away. She simply placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, a touch that said everything words could not. A lifetime of effort, of unseen work, of quiet sacrifice acknowledged in a single moment. Jonathan watched them for a second, his expression thoughtful, as if considering something beyond the stage, beyond the performance. Then he turned back to the audience once more, his voice calm, but carrying a new kind of clarity. "Tonight was not planned," he said. and a faint ripple of understanding moved through the room. And perhaps that is why it mattered, he continued. Because it reminded us that the most important things rarely arrive with permission. A few heads nodded, slowly, thoughtfully, as if the words were settling into something deeper than agreement. He paused, letting the silence hold, then added, "What you witnessed was not just talent, it was presence, the kind that exists whether we notice it or not." His gaze moved briefly across the room, not accusing, but inviting reflection. "And the question is not whether it exists," he said softly, "but whether we choose to see it." The weight of that question did not demand an answer. It simply remained, lingering in the minds of everyone present. Emily looked up at him, her expression calm, but her eyes carrying a quiet awareness. She understood now, not fully, not all at once, but enough to feel the shift, enough to recognize that the world she had known had just widened in a way she could not yet measure. Jonathan nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them, then turned toward the side of the stage where the event organizers stood, their expressions a mix of surprise and uncertainty, unsure how to proceed in a moment that had moved beyond any schedule. But Jonathan did not wait for direction. He simply stepped forward again, returning to Emily's side, not to guide her, but to stand with her. And in that simple act, the message became clear. This was not a passing moment, not something to be quietly moved past. It was something to be carried forward, something that would leave this room and continue in ways none of them could fully predict. And as the lights held steady and the hall remained wrapped in that rare, shared stillness, it became undeniable that what had begun as an unexpected interruption had transformed into something far more enduring, something that would not fade when the doors closed, but would continue, quietly, in every place where someone chose to listen a little more closely than before. Months passed, but the night did not fade. It echoed in ways none of them had expected, not in headlines or grand announcements, but in quieter, more meaningful shifts, in a small studio lined with worn wood panels and sunlight filtering through tall windows. Emily Carter sat at a different piano now, not hidden in a corner, not waiting to be unnoticed, but seated at the center of a room where her presence was not only accepted, it was expected. Jonathan Reeves stood nearby, not towering, not distant, but attentive, listening with the same stillness he had shown that first night. Their sessions were not rushed, not driven by pressure, but shaped by patience, by a shared understanding that what she carried could not be forced into form. It had to be guided, gently, carefully. Laura often waited by the door, no longer holding a tray, no longer watching from the margins, but sitting quietly with a book in her hands. Her posture relaxed in a way it had never been before, because for the first time, she did not have to wonder where her daughter belonged. She could see it. She could hear it in every note that filled the room. Emily's playing had changed, not in its essence, but in its reach. The fragments she once pieced together in silence were now expanding, shaped by new knowledge, new experiences, yet never losing the instinct that made them hers. Jonathan did not try to replace that instinct. He protected it. He nurtured it, understanding that what made her different was not something to refine away, but something to preserve. And beyond that room, the world began to notice, not all at once, not with noise, but with quiet curiosity. Invitations arrived, not demanding, but open. Spaces that once felt closed began to shift, slowly, carefully, making room for something new, something real. And yet, through all of it, Emily remained the same in the ways that mattered. She still listened before she played, still paused before each note as if asking the music what it needed, still carried that quiet presence that had once gone unseen. Jonathan watched this growth with a sense of calm he had not known in years, because he understood now that what had begun that night was not an exception. It was a continuation, something that had always been there, waiting, and in a small gesture that spoke louder than any performance, he returned to the house on Maple Ridge, climbing the narrow stairs to the attic where dust and time had settled undisturbed. The old box was still there, the tape inside, worn, fragile, but intact. He held it for a moment, not as a relic, but as a reminder of what had been left unfinished and what had now been carried forward, not by him, but by someone who had no reason to find it. except that she listened when others did not. And as he closed the box and stepped back into the light, there was no sense of loss, only a quiet understanding that some things are not meant to stay hidden, that sometimes the most important voices are the ones we never think to hear until someone unexpected brings them back to life years later. The memory of that night did not belong to a single moment anymore. It had become something that lived quietly in many places, in concert halls where audiences leaned forward just a little more, in classrooms where teachers paused before dismissing a quiet student, in small rooms where someone sat at an old piano and wondered if their voice mattered. And in one particular hall, brighter now with a different kind of anticipation, a name appeared on a program that once would have been impossible to imagine. Emily Carter, the letters simple, unadorned, yet carrying a weight built over time, over patience, over countless hours of listening. Before playing, Jonathan Reeves sat in the audience this time, not hidden, but not at the center either, his presence steady, his gaze calm, no longer searching for something lost, but witnessing something fulfilled. The lights dimmed gently. The air settled into that familiar stillness. And when Emily walked onto the stage, she did not rush. She did not perform for approval. She simply arrived. The same quiet presence she had always carried now visible to everyone. She sat at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys, and for a brief moment, the world held its breath again, not out of doubt, but out of trust, because they knew something real was about to unfold. The first note came, clear and unforced, followed by another, and another. The music no longer a fragment, no longer something unfinished, but whole, complete in a way that did not close anything, but opened something new, something that could continue beyond the last note. Jonathan watched with a quiet sense of peace, not pride in the way the world might expect, but something deeper, something that came from seeing a story move forward without needing to control it. Laura sat a few rows behind him, her posture relaxed, her eyes bright, no longer watching from the edges, but fully present in a world that had once felt out of reach. And as the music filled the space, it carried with it everything that had led to this moment: the attic, the tape, the silence, the laughter, the recognition, all of it, woven together into something that no longer belonged to the past, but to the present, and to the future. When the final note faded, the applause rose, warm and full, but it did not define the moment, it simply acknowledged it, because what mattered most had already happened. Something unseen had been seen, something unheard had been heard, and something underestimated had revealed its truth. And long after the lights dimmed and the hall emptied, that truth remained, quiet but unshakable, that worth does not wait for permission, that talent does not ask to be believed, and that sometimes the most powerful voices begin in places the world forgets to notice, until one day they are impossible to ignore.